Welcome back to the PloughCast. This is episode 6 of the series covering the latest issue of the magazine, Made Perfect.
Today, we'll be taking listener questions and then having deep thoughts of our own, possibly. I'm Susannah Black, senior editor at Plough.
And I'm Peter Mompson, editor-in-chief of Plough. This is the episode where we hear from you and then try to figure out what, if anything, we've learned from doing this issue. First off, questions and answers.
So, question 1 is actually from a Twitter personality called Pontius Pilates, whose anonymity we are protecting by not telling who he is, although we know. And he said yesterday, I've only listened to a couple of episodes and read a couple of articles so far, but I've been surprised not to encounter the idea that disability is a social, not a natural phenomenon. What counts as ability or disability is a function of what societies construe as normal or required or good.
In other words, what do we think about the so-called social model of disability, which is a whole bunch of syllables for a really important insight?
Right.
We should first explain what we're even talking about,
Okay.
right? Because the social theory of disability, for those who aren't following it, is summarized a little by Pontius Pilates' question
Dr. Pilates.
that disability is something that is created by your social context or your economic context or like the architectural context that you live in. And it distinguishes between disability and impairment. So if I have a non-typical arm, then as Leah Labresco said in a previous episode, I may need a different kind of door opener, right? And the disability doesn't come from this arm that doesn't function as other people's arms might, but it comes from the fact that people insist on putting door handles or doorknobs on doors that aren't suited for me. So the disability comes from, in that case, from actually the way my environment is structured and not from how I am, right?
Yeah. And I mean, so like the Steelman case for this is something like left-handedness. Left-handedness is not in any way a disability. It's not even, you could call it an impairment if for some reason you wanted to say, I think actually some of the church fathers actually did say that right-handedness was the normal and good thing and left-handedness was like an aberration. But that's, obviously the reason that left-handedness is perceived as a disability sometimes sort of in a very, very minor way is because scissors are designed for people with right-handed people. So like that's a kind of maximalist, the thing to do is like make scissors for left-handed people.
And then there's all the other cases. For instance, people who are blind can only not read books if you don't have books in Braille.
That they can read, right? Or
right.
that they, or if you don't have, right. So like the solution there is like make a whole bunch of audiobooks. Like these are things that are kind of easy. Well, let's just help people to be as fully and thrivingly human as they can.
A person who uses a wheelchair is only disabled or prevented from participating in some type of public function if the
There's
venue
no ramp.
that is held has no ramp.
So, yeah.
And so I'm not sure what we should say about that, except that as far as it goes, we absolutely agree that model has a lot of value. And I'll give an example. When I was a kid, there was a school child. There was a girl a little older than me with Down syndrome. This was now mid-1980s. And at that point, to have Down syndrome still meant a pretty short lifespan. At least that was people's expectation, although thankfully she is still doing great. But at the time, she was treated very kindly, but also was in no way sort of integrated or mainstream. She was part of the school community, but she didn't kind of run with the pack. Now we know that people with Down syndrome can do all kinds of things. For those of you coming at this podcast for the first time on this episode, in the first episode of this series, we talked about my late friend Dwayne, who is my fellow editor, Maureen's brother, who was deeply disabled, couldn't talk, couldn't walk, had an extremely damaged brain from lifelong epilepsy and a bunch of other conditions that went with it. There was no way that his, whether you want to call it impairment or disability, this was not socially constructed. This was not economically or culturally constructed. This was a man who was suffering.
Not always, and not only.
Not always, who gave a lot, who was a fully human being. And isn't it crazy, though, that we have to say, even though he was suffering, he really was human?
Yeah.
Like, why are those things in tension?
Yeah. And I mean, what Maureen said is like that there were times in their family's life what their family did, which I didn't know until she told me this morning, was that basically all of the siblings, and it's her and 4 brothers, and they basically made a pact together as a family, PACT, together as a family, that whatever Dwayne couldn't participate in, they would just try and make as much as possible. Family activities would be things that Dwayne would be able to participate in. And so they would just structure their decisions about what to do as, when they were having family time in that way. And she said the times that they had tried to just think of Dwayne and invite other people to see him as just another kid in a wheelchair, like there are plenty of kids in wheelchairs, but Dwayne she said that actually didn't serve him or them very well because he was not just another kid in a wheelchair. Like there are things that most much less profoundly disabled people in wheelchairs can do that Dwayne couldn't do, and not acknowledging that or pretending, expecting that that's not real, was actually really hard on both Dwayne and on them. So, I mean, one of the things that, like, thinking about this more carefully, such as I, in as much as I have been trying to, it seems like it's just to call disability this one category is really misleading, because we're talking about like a jillion different things from like, and of different kinds. Like, intellectual disability is something different from even profound physical disability. Like if you think about Stephen Hawking, like to use this one word to encompass all of this stuff and say here is the kind of correct way to think about it, I think, just destroys the particularity of each of these people, because what is true about each disabled person is that they are a person. They're like, there's no one who is a quasi-person. There's no one who is like mostly made in the image of God. Each of these people with all of these different, things going on that all of which we call disability, what's also true of them is that they are a person made in the image of God. They're our brother and sister or sister.
And I think that's what I wanted to come down to as well, is that neither of us belong to the disability community, if you want to, use language like that. I certainly can't speak for Dwayne. His family can't speak for Dwayne. Actually, nobody can speak for Dwayne, and Dwayne can't speak for Dwayne because he can't talk. Mm-hmm. So to put everybody kind of into a box, a sort of class, that's sort of my trouble with the social theory of disabilities. I think there's people for whom that certainly fits, but I wonder if it really fits for those who are actually unable to express themselves, who maybe have impairments so great that they are unable to communicate their own point of view, and we should also not presume to do that for them. And we may. And I say this carefully, but we may also just have to get a little more comfortable with sitting with the fact that one can be a fully human person made in the image of God and yet have a life that involves suffering, and that we kind of are able to hold those two things together. That kind of brings us to our next reader question here. One reader wrote in, how can we as a society avoid paternalism in our care for disabled people? How does that look?
Right. And I think, again, first of all, my instinct is paternalism is not a bad word for me. When somebody needs a father, it is good for there to be paternalism around. When, just in the way that religion is a crutch. Yes, it definitely is. And as Ross, Douthat mentioned on our previous podcast with him,
crutches are good.
Yeah,
so
when you break your leg, crutches are great. Sometimes paternalism is good. I think that what is probably deeply annoying to people who are, fall into the category of disability, but who just kind of want to get on with their lives and, even on meritocratic terms, just try to succeed as much as they can. I would be deeply irritated if somebody like looked at me and kind of said, there, like, let me help you, like, sort of infantilized me as an adult woman because I had whatever condition that made them feel like infantilization was appropriate. So, like, I don't know. It feels like a major thing here again is like, try not to be prejudiced in a very sort of specific way. Try not to prejudge what someone is or is like, or how you ought to treat them. Try to be chill and normal, I guess, is one way to put it.
And trying to answer this question, I'm running into the same problem we had with the first one, is that who are we talking about? Right. What are the experiences that we're describing? So I'm not sure that I have a lot more useful to say is, I think the bad paternalism that everyone hates, right? Whether it's kind of chauvinistic guys, who mansplain, or people who are more educated than somebody else and let everyone else know, is, anyone who's full of themselves and not fully attentive to the essential equality of the person who's across from him or her. And, that's what I had to learn with Dwayne, as I tell in my editorial, that sneaking suspicion that my achievements, such as they are, or my qualifications, or, what kind of technocratic, points I've scored in life, somehow are what make me important compared to somebody who maybe hasn't had the opportunity to do that. In any situation, whether with people with disabilities or not, that's just a bad thing. It's a rude thing, and it's a deeply unchristian thing. It is unfortunately a fairly natural thing as well. So it's one of those things you got to get in the habit of maybe approaching people differently than we do. Do you have a question that you wanted to get into here?
I actually had I wanted to address a comment, which is pretty intensely awful.
What was you should first say which article the comment is
the comment
responding
is
to.
In response to, so Sarah Williams is a Plough author. She's actually has a book with us. The book and the piece, by implication, or by extension, are about her daughter, Carrion, who was diagnosed with a condition which meant that she wouldn't really survive past birth, or it was very, very, very unlikely. And everyone told Sarah and Paul, her husband, that they needed, that Sarah needed to get an abortion. The doctors, they live in the UK. The doctors were universally, basically, they had to really fight to not have an abortion. But they didn't. She didn't. And Carrion was born and died. And that happened. And somebody on Twitter commented on this article, "Fortunate child to not live long enough to enter a life of suffering imposed by parents' egotistical beliefs."
Well, that really flips things.
Yeah.
And needless to say, I think it's safe to say that both of us couldn't disagree more with this. And yet, you can say a horrible person. She's actually expressing a set of beliefs that are pretty much the law of the land in this country.
Mm-hmm. And that, I hate to try to steelman this, and I can't really. But, like, if you genuinely think that there's nothing about humans that means that humans shouldn't kill them, if you genuinely think that avoiding suffering is the maximum good thing that you can do for your child, in avoiding their suffering is the maximum good thing that you can do for your child, and that suffering is always bad, and that there's just not a transcendent value in human life such that it's sacred, then like the best thing you can do for your child when they are suffering is to kill it. And to not do that is selfish or egotistical in some way. But the
assumption here that the parents are egotistical for somehow imposing life on their child is, it's wrong and it's bad, but it's also just wild.
I don't really understand I have to say I don't totally understand why egotistical would be the word that they would choose.
I think because the parents, these presumably religiously motivated parents are feeding their own sense of righteousness by somehow bringing a child into the world only to have that child suffer. And this is, right, this is sort of a layman's version of Peter Singer's utilitarianism, that, you know, and of course his notorious argument that infants with disabilities, you know, ought to be, not just can be, but basically ought to be euthanized by their parents. Again, big footnote here, this is not even assisted dying by an autonomous person seeking to end his or her own life.
This is infanticide.
This is involuntary killing. Yeah. And what is the thing that is being prevented? This horrible suffering that no human being in history has ever had to live with suffering, right? Like this shying away from any idea that human life just might involve suffering. This comment, for all its kind of trollishness, gets at a set of attitudes that basically that's why we put this issue of Plough together, is to try to get at them. Yeah. Hopefully not in a way that's, you know, just finger wagging and, you know, you terrible people. But I really hope that some of the stories we told, and especially, for instance, in the article by Maureen Swinger, The Art of Disability Parenting, as well as in pieces by Amy Julia Becker and by Victoria Farmer, just telling those kinds of stories is the best argument I can think of against this whole approach. Yeah.
I mean, there's one other thing I'd want to say is that, like, this is a question of, this is to a certain degree a matter of fact. Like, what we believe as Christians is that children aren't ours to kill. Like, we're not ours to kill. Like, each human life is sort of almost unfathomably holy and important, belongs to God, is made in his image. There are no ordinary people. C.S. Lewis has this line about, like, you go out and you look at, like, all the sort of homeless people, you look at, like, the annoying lunch lady, you look at, like, your sort of annoying siblings, every sort of miscellaneous person on the subway, and there are no ordinary people. And each of those beings, each of those creatures that you're looking at is either going to be someone, he says, who you would run from in terror because they're going to become something horrifying, or they're going to be something that you would be sorely tempted to worship. And the holiness, which can be corrupted, obviously, but which is never lost, is at the center of human anthropology in as we think about it as Christians. And we don't have it in us to let that go. Not when we look at ourselves and not when we look at anyone else.
So I think that's a great segue into the next question that I want to get into, which is from Spencer on Twitter. How can we help society to see disabled people as good for their own sake when society does not share the Christian commitment to universalism and the Imago Dei, and the image of God? Right. So you've just been talking about the image of God and the Christian belief that we certainly both share. That is because each disabled person, each non-disabled person is created in the image of God. That is why their life is sacred. Mm-hmm. But if you don't share that belief,
what are you going to do?
What are you going to do? What else is there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I had a couple of ideas, and the way that to sort of like encapsulate how I was thinking of this is like, how can we address this by common grace or by natural law? So, like, Christians have this idea that as well as like special revelation, we also, like, there's a lot of stuff that, you know, God didn't really need to reveal to us through prophets or anything like that, or through Christ, but just we know through reason, we know through conscience. You know, we Christians don't think that like everyone who's not a Christian doesn't have a conscience or anything like that, or can't think about right and wrong. We all can and do constantly think about right and wrong, whether or not we're Christians. So, you know, a couple of things that we can just notice about human life is that, you know, we need to be needed. It's not just that, like, if you are disabled or something, you need help. It's that you don't have a good human life if nobody ever needs you. Like, and therefore, people who have disabilities are in some sense an incredible blessing, an incredible gift to the rest of us who might be able to help them, that's the paternalism bit. Like there's all kinds of other, ways to think about it that are more traditionally like they also have like autonomous subjective rights. They ought to be allowed to make their own life plans and thrive. Those are kind of like I guess you would call them Lockean or liberal or Rawlsian ways of approaching this, but like more in a, again, not Christian, but kind of a little bit deeper way of thinking about it. To be needed is not a bad thing. And to be someone who calls out care in someone else is not a bad thing. And, if you're someone who is disabled and feels or, is sort of looking at the end of your life and a great deal of care is going to be needed to give to you, like it might be that those who are going to be giving you care need to be able to give that care. And you might not realize it, but by ending your own life, you might be stealing something from them that they need. You might be, just given that what we know about suicide and how it impacts families, and I think this is true of like late in life assisted suicide as well, to even if it's like a little bit more muted in certain ways. I think that you're unleashing intergenerational, multi-generational pain if you choose to kill yourself on those who you care about. And I think that this is again not a observation based on like Christianity. This is just like human stuff if we let ourselves see it. To do that to yourself is hurting the whole world. And to stay alive is one of the greatest gifts you can give to the world, and allow others to help you when you need help.
Looking at this question, the way I think about it is society actually knows that people with disabilities are good in themselves. With one half of its brain. And without using the language of the Imago Dei, the image of God, our legal system tends to use words like dignity, right? So, for instance, the famous first line of the German Constitution is the dignity of man is inviolable, right? And that's written into all kinds of things, and specifically in regard to disability, is written into a 2007 UN convention, this language of dignity. And that's one great way to talk to people about it, because people actually realize that when, for instance, babies with disabilities are selected for abortion, that is a violation of dignity, not only of those babies who are killed, but also by implication, a kind of enacted violence against born people with disabilities. That's something that people realize and people are very squeamish about. And you can see in journalism and writing about issues like, say, Iceland's eradication of all babies with disability, a kind of nervousness, it doesn't sit well with people. People recognize that although they may believe, for instance, in a woman's right to choose an abortion, they see that that's really in conflict with fully affirming the dignity of those with disabilities. So I think one way we talk to people about it is to lean into the intuition that's already there, that like, the dignity of each human being is inviolable, and just insist, and it really is inviolable. Full stop. Yeah, and without an asterisk.
Yeah, and that means that it's inviolable by you as well. And when you violate your own, dignity through choosing some kind of like assisted suicide or something like that, as well as when you violate someone else's by choosing abortion or, involuntary euthanasia, you're not just attacking that one person. You're attacking everyone else, like literally every other person, because every other human being, you're making it a less safe world for them. You're making it a world that is less likely to affirm their existence, that, implies that they need to make an argument, make a case for themselves, that implies that, everyone needs to at all times be both very happy, not suffering, maximizing their productivity, in order to prove that, they have enough utils or whatever that, John Stuart Mill metric is, to continue to live for one more day. And that's not good. That's not real. That's not true. Let's not do that.
Now, I do think if we use language like dignity, it's on us too, as Christians, to work really hard to create a culture where that word dignity is filled with the essential meaning of what Scripture calls the image of God. That word doesn't get unmoored and start meaning something else.
Yeah.
But that's a discussion maybe for another day. Let's look at another question.
Excellent.
Should we talk about cities?
Yeah. Matt Robert, who is a friend of the pod and an urbanist, says, how can we redesign/rebuild cities to be more open and accommodating to people with disabilities? I really love this idea.
Okay, so let's of course everyone's going to say yes, we should do that, right? And so do we. But let me just come at another tack, because I was talking about Leah Labresco's piece about designing for those with disability the other day. And, the person I was talking to about it actually pushed back a bit. And he said, imagine redesigning Venice to make the entire city wheelchair accessible. What would be lost?
Wow. Okay, yeah.
So, and he was like, are you really sure that you want to, create concrete accessibility ramps, all over Venice or Rome or, Tokyo? I was kind of left, opening and shutting my mouth for a while.
I kind of feel like that too, actually. Because I was all in. As soon as Matt sent this in, I was like, yes, let's do it. And I was thinking, like, get rid of cars, like make it like that step, or not to get rid of cars, but like, make it be much more pedestrian friendly and slow pedestrian friendly. It's easy enough to put in ramps. Like this is kind of an easy win. But I think there actually might be cases when there is something lost. And that's a really freaky thing to think about. One of the ways that we can think about what disabled people might need is helpers. And I'm thinking about, the lame man's friends who kind of knocked the whatever sort of covering off the roof and let him down inside the house where Jesus was so that Jesus could heal him. It seems like probably the best way for a disabled person to see Venice is to see it with a bunch of people who are his friends and helpers who would be able to like physically help him. Because that's like respecting the integrity of the city as it is, and also like, not, enabling this person to also have the experience of the city as it is, which would, if the city were changed such as to make it perfectly accessible to someone who is disabled, when that person who is disabled, saw it, it wouldn't be the same city. So, I think that friends and helpers are kind of the solution here, if in that particular case.
And again, are we making it open and accommodating to which people,
right,
with which disabilities? That said, many places are not Venice.
Mm-hmm.
Most places are not Venice.
All but one.
And I think there is clearly way more that can be done to make cities, and first, good for kids, good for people with disabilities, good for families, good for old people, so they don't need to be put away into, old people's homes where they, die of COVID, as they tragically have here in the Hudson Valley over the last 2 years. There's so much more that could be done to make cities true cities, where people live together of all generations with all different kinds of ability and disability. Cities that are good for people.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, if you start, if you hear this and you start saying like, oh, but that's gonna be, it's gonna involve a lot of changes, it's gonna like really disrupt, blah blah blah. We did this to make cities accessible to cars, and cars are not as important as people, and therefore, I think that we can
could probably do a lot, a lot more.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of you who sent in questions.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we're getting into what did we, as in you, Susannah, and I, what did we learn from doing this series on Made Perfect, Ability and Disability? Do you want to start?
Sure. I definitely feel like I was starting kind of from zero, in the sense of like I hadn't really thought much about this. I feel like, especially in terms of sort of sensitivities around the way people talk about disability and think about disability and that sort of thing, and the social model of disability, like I just hadn't thought very carefully. It wasn't something that I'd really run into much. I feel like the biggest thing that I've learned pretty quickly after we got started on this issue, like 3 months ago or whatever it was, is that, you know, when someone first mentioned it, the topic, like, let's do an issue on disability, I was like, that's kind of niche. And the biggest thing I've learned is that, like, this is not niche, because not only are there so many more people who fall into this incredibly overgeneralized category than you would think, because for various reasons, one of which is our society kind of makes visible the people who are able and kind of in their peak earning years and kind of look nice. It kind of invisibilizes people who don't, you know, function or look or seem the way that, you know, we feel most comfortably that they ought to. But also that, you know, questions about disability just touch really directly on both questions of basic humanity, like what does it mean to be human, which applies to all of us, and also just cut right to the chase in terms of Christian hope. Like, the main thing that disability, or a main thing that disability, thinking about profound disability in particular, does is, like, what are you hoping for? Like, if someone's just not going to be able to succeed meritocratically and is not going to be able to do a human flourishing, do we believe or don't we that there's the resurrection of the body? And, like, what does that belief imply about the way that we can think about difficulties of various kinds, suffering of various degrees, annoyance of various degrees, obligation? Like, is either this is true or it's not. And, you know, this topic really has kind of shoved that right in my face in a very helpful way, I think.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that, so one thing I've learned, similar to what you said, is although I had thought, you know, since my experience with Dwayne and also just with, you know, others with disability that I've known, somewhat about this topic, I still, when we began, I was thinking about disability as them, those people. Now, the chances are that most of us talking and listening are heading into disability ourselves. You know, millions of people get Alzheimer's or Parkinson's every year. Simple old age brings with it, you know, all kinds of impairments. Those are all things that are facing most of us, right? So when we're talking about disability, we're not talking about other people. We're talking about possibly ourselves. And with that came to me that we so often think about disability as the topic, as the, so to speak, problem to be solved, when maybe it's ability that we should be thinking of as the problem to be solved. Because the flip side of, you know, technocracy or meritocracy or whatever you want to, you know, the big words we use to describe measuring people by their economically valuable or socially valuable achievements, is that while we then think that those who aren't able to succeed in those ways are less valuable, and we think that's a problem, and we've talked about that, it also means that those who are able to succeed in those ways think that those achievements belong to them. And so maybe it's the goals and purposes of ability that we need to question just as much. And of course, in the Gospels, Jesus does that. He speaks of the parable of the talents, and those talents are not yours. So if for a number of years, maybe a number of decades, maybe for most of your life, you don't live with impairments or disability, those are things lent to you to do stuff with. And
you better not screw up what you're doing with them. Like, that's not yours to decide what to do with. That's not yours to use for only your own good. Like, if you have the ability to thrive, and I mean, even just in terms of thinking of, like, if you don't have a disability, therefore you might, you know, be able to get stronger or get healthier, and you don't do that, that's kind of a bit problematic too, because if you were stronger or healthier, you would be able to help more. Like, there's the way of, like, thinking of everyone's ability as kind of belonging to everyone not in a kind of creepy collectivist way, but in a kingdom of God way. If all of our potentials, all of our talents, all of everything that we could develop, everything that we have developed, if all of that is really for the kingdom and for each other and to help, what do we do every day? How do we live every day, if that's true?
Let's get back to Socrates. We talked about Socrates at the beginning of this, right? And this quote that shows up on gym walls about, every man, has a duty to basically be all he can be. And Athens. For Athens, right? Well, yeah, in this case, for a city nearby Athens, right? Okay. And that every man has a duty to achieve the greatest degree of physical perfection that he can. And maybe that's the way that what's true about what Socrates said right there is true in the sense of looking at ability as a talent that you can use for others. Yeah, and then you really do have that duty. Yeah. You need to push yourself so that you can be there for others during those years, recognizing that it's temporary, that you're going to have that strength, have that ability, mental, physical, whatever it might be. And you're going to make the most of those years when you have it. And then also be able to, without rancor, relinquish it, when the time comes.
And receive help in your own turn. This is just so much of all of what we're talking about just seems like remedial human stuff. We were talking to Kelsey yesterday about kind of what it means to live according to the Torah. And it just again and again, thinking of things in terms of how they're described in the Bible, thinking of things in terms of basic Christian concepts and basic Jewish concepts. It's sort of we know, how could we have forgotten this? How could we have started thinking of ourselves in a different way where with this huge emphasis on living for ourselves and on our own personal agency and on our sort of making commitments, making decisions that are purely based on our will. That's just so fake. That's not real. That's not what human life is. I feel like a huge thing that this issue has taught me is just it's reminded me what human life is, which is, I think, a good thing for a Christian magazine to do. I guess one other thing that I'd like to talk about is the way that I felt a lot of the disability rights language that we were running into when we were sort of thinking about how to incorporate different ways of thinking about disability into this issue, just as much as the kind of technocratic, meritocracy-based way of thinking about humans is, I think, lacking. I think some of the disability rights ways of thinking about disabled people are lacking, in the sense that I just am a little bit unnerved or worried about the idea of thinking of disabled people as a political class who have a sort of political interest in the way that some disabled advocates sort of tend to talk about them. There's something there, but it seems like what that's trying to get at is the need for human solidarity between people of all abilities.
Well, I think that's the weakness of rights language in general, is that it gets at real truths. And boy, if you look at the history of the way people with disabilities have been treated in this country and actually throughout human history, is there ever reason for a disability rights movement, disability justice? There's nobody's arguing with that. Yeah. And yet, rights language is extremely limiting and can become misleading if we then take our eyes off of what really matters, which is the individual human being, his or her flourishing as an image of God and being loved and being able to love.
In a community that is the fullest living in which community helps them to be the fullest expression of that individual self that they are.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, Susannah, and thanks to all our listeners for joining us on this journey. And we look forward to the next series of the PloughCast, which will be on
music.
Till then.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes or your app of choice and rate us. This is the last podcast for this issue, but for the next 6 weeks, you will be able to download one audio article per week. And we'll be back in a month and a half with a podcast series full of music.